Hello everybody, I'm Dean Bertram and welcome to my Weird Library. Today I'm going to be talking about a book that had a fairly profound impact on me and is probably the reason I went on to pursue the UFO phenomenon, or at least UFO belief, at an academic level. But let's rewind for a moment. I was fascinated, like probably all kids who grew up in the 70s, with UFOs. I'd seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I watched Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of. The radio waves were always belting out tunes by David Bowie or Styx or the Carpenters talking about ET contact. But as I grew up, I kind of put that behind me. By the time I was in high school, I spent very little time thinking about UFOs or extraterrestrials. And it wasn't until after high school, in my early college years, when I was in my early 20s, that I picked up a book on UFO abduction, which just captivated me and bothered me at a very profound and existential level. And you're probably thinking, well, it was probably one of these two books, right? Like Whitley Strieber's Communion, with the cover that, probably launched A Million Nightmares, or Bud Hopkins' Intruders. And they were certainly the two gateway books to UFO alien abduction belief. And in fact, there's a fascinating backstory of those books, if I could find it here somewhere. Here it is. The skeptic Philip Klass talks about in UFO Abductions, A Dangerous Game. He's perhaps most famous UFO skeptic ever, after maybe Donald Menzel, who was writing earlier than Klass. But Klass talks about this incredible rivalry between Hopkins and Strieber to be the first to get their book published, because they were both published in early 1987, and Strieber ultimately beat Hopkins to the punch, and supposedly Hopkins never really forgave him for it. And while both books were in the New York Times and were bestsellers, Strieber's Communion had already become the dominant new UFO abduction book. But as I said, it wasn't either of those books that I first read. In fact, I'd read neither of those books. What I first picked up was this book called Edith Fiore's Encounters. I saw it on a sale table out the front of a bookstore in the northern suburbs of Sydney, and for some reason I felt incredibly attracted to it. I picked it up it was almost like magnetic. I couldn't put it down, even though I hadn't thought about UFO abductions or alien belief for a very long time. And I read the book, obviously cover to cover, and as I was going through it, even from the very early pages, it bothered me. Fiore was a psychologist who worked with patients who'd been abducted by aliens. Indeed, she says her patients were often surprised to find out they'd been abducted by aliens when she went through the type of hypnotherapy with them, which kind of begs the question, what was she looking for with them anyway, to find out they'd been abducted by aliens? Now, Edith Fiore, in fairness, even says at the beginning of the book that she'd been essentially obsessed with extraterrestrials since reading Donald Kehoe's book, Flying Saucers. His book was called Flying Saucers Are Real was his first book. I almost said Flying Saucers Have Landed, which was, of course, Adamski's book. But when she read Kehoe's book in one day, she says in 1950, she forever after believed in the extraterrestrial hypothesis. She thought ETs were visiting the Earth, and she would sit outside at nights watching the sky. So she had a pretty big dog in the extraterrestrial hypothesis belief fight. So one has to wonder how much she was perhaps playing around with her patient's subconscious. But I didn't think of any of these things. I hadn't thought about UFOs since, again, I was a child. So the first thing I thought wasn't, warning flags are going up. What's actually going on here in this therapeutic situation where a woman who vehemently confirms or believes in the existence of extraterrestrials is poking around her patients' heads and finding abduction tales. What I took from it when I first started to read it was almost like the same suggestions or suggestibility that a patient might have undergoing hypnosis. I suspect I underwent some of that reading the book, because Edith Fiore sets you up as the reader, saying if you ever had any memories or have any memories of bedroom visitors, or if any of this book makes you feel uncomfortable or, makes your heart rate increase. And of course, it's a scary book. There's multiple cases with alien abductions in there and people being abducted. So most people are probably going to feel a little ill at ease, particularly early on in the day. This book came out in 1989, 2 years after the two books I showed before by Strieber and Hopkins, but it was still fairly early in the process. People hadn't been really completely desensitized, so it would bother you. It's the same way as perhaps if you read It by Stephen King and your heart rate increased. It didn't mean you were really abducted by a spooky clown into the sewers when you were a child. It just means that you have a normal reaction to scary scenarios. But I didn't think of any of that when I read it. And she spoke about, do you have any memories in dreams of visitations or anything coming into your room? And I hadn't thought about this for the longest time. But when I was a child, I don't know the exact age, I guess around 5 years of age, I had indeed had a regular or an ongoing nightmare come bedroom visitation about this little man who came into my room and took me away. Now, just to make sure that I'm very clear, the little man in no way resembled your standard extraterrestrial grey alien with the big bulbous head and the inverted teardrop eyes. He was more like perhaps you would see somebody with proportional dwarfism in an old Todd Browning movie like Freaks, or in the old Wizard of Oz. You know, those type of little people. He looked like he was compacted. He looked, if anything, like the goblin sitting on the chest of the woman in the famous Nightmare painting, which is, I suppose, burnt into everybody's consciousness by now. Everybody's seen that painting by Fuseli, I think, is the artist. But certainly as a child, I don't believe I ever would have seen that painting. And I don't believe when I was 5 I'd been exposed to Close Encounters yet, or to In Search of yet, or to any of these type of alien tropes that I would have been exposed to later in my life. So I certainly never considered the little man experience having anything to do with alien abduction. But when I read Fiore's book, it all came back to me. Not that I'd ever forgotten about it, I just hadn't thought about it, regularly. And I began to think, maybe I'm an alien abductee. This little man did take me away, and I don't have very many or very clear memories of the place that he took me to, except I do have one memory that stands out of myself and the little man being in this well-lit, at least compared to the dark room, or my bedroom where the experience began, in this relatively well-lit, I think, largish room, but there were lots of tall figures standing around us, and I suppose as a child you're used to people being much larger, parents and the like standing next to you, and I remember pulling on one of the creatures or beings' legs next to me, thinking it was my mother, as children do. They pull on their parents' legs when they're in a store or at a party or something, wanting to get attention, and the thing bent down. It wasn't my mother, I soon realised, and its head was inches from me, and it had a completely inhuman visage. I mean, I don't want to try to describe it because it's so long ago. I'm not sure how much I've been contaminated by the hundreds of science fiction and horror movies I've watched. But it didn't look like a grey extraterrestrial, and it certainly didn't look human. And that's the only really strong memory I have of where I got taken to. Now, the interesting, I suppose, denouement to that story is the little man eventually stopped coming, but only after a particular encounter. And I remember very clearly the little man coming to my room and just knowing with all of my being that if I went with the little man this time, if I let him take me, that I'd never come back. And I fought the little man. Not like punching him upside the head like a boxing match or anything, but wrestling with him on the top of my bed. And I don't know if I can say I beat him, but I certainly came to some kind of impasse, and the little man left. And he never returned after I resisted that night. And perhaps I've often just assumed it was my childhood subconscious or psyche working through something. But what's always bothered me is when I think about that encounter, it has a very strong physical memory. I can remember the exertion of struggling with the little man, and it reminds me of similar fights with boys I remember having at that age as boys tussle in playgrounds and the like. That physicality in the memory is very familiar. Now, take that as you will. Does it mean I had a physical experience? Maybe not. Maybe I just entered the type of imaginal realm that people like Henry Corbin talk about, where while it isn't entirely this world, it isn't entirely another, it's somewhere in between. It's not all just in our heads, but we're interconnecting with something else, and it can feel sometimes realer than the real world. Anyway, that's my little man encounter, and for a long time after reading Edith Fiore's book, which was filled with abduction stories, I really was concerned about the possibility I was an abductee. And I read a lot more in the field. That's why I ended up doing my PhD eventually in UFO belief, not to try to find an answer to what happened to me, because by then I'd read enough abduction books and enough UFO lore and also enough skeptical material and enough about false memories and enough about sleep paralysis and the like not to think I was an abductee anymore. But I often wonder what would have happened if I had ran with that initial experience, because so much of abduction lore, or so many abduction narratives, are based on people only remembering parts of an experience or finding a strange mark on their body or having dreams of floating. And those type of things are listed even in Fiore's book as indicating that you're an abductee. And certainly Bud Hopkins, whose book I showed a moment ago, his first book, Intruders, and David Jacobs, who's written a number of books on alien abduction and was a type of partner with Bud Hopkins before he died. Around the same time I read Fiore's Encounters, had taken a poll which supposedly indicated, if you extrapolated the numbers, that there were millions of abductees in the United States of America. And it was based on questions like, do you have dreams of flying, or do you have memories of things being in your room, or do you have any strange marks on your body? So the entire, I suppose, mythology, not dismissing it, but that's what's grown up around or grew up around abduction belief, was that a small thing could indicate that even though you couldn't remember it, you were abducted. And interestingly, another book which is worth mentioning is D.W. Pasulka's American Cosmic. And Pasulka writes about something called the book encounter. She describes how often people who've had an anomalous experience might read a book with something very similar to their experience, or something which brings to memory or brings to mind their experience, and then they're able to locate that experience within a pre-existent belief system. And that encounter with the book, much like when I found Edith Fiore's Encounters, it seems very meaningful to them. Now, I think that probably does apply across the paranormal and UFO and all kinds of esoteric fields. If you read something which seems to validate your belief that you have ghosts in your house, you're more likely probably to think they're ghosts, the things knocking in your walls, for example, if you've read a story or you've read an account which has that experience. But I think abduction stories go one step further, or much of abduction lore goes one step further, again because it suggests that you can't remember the fact that you've been abducted, and the fact that people writing like Edith Fiore are already very talented at feeling somebody out for their experiences, so they put all kinds of triggers, I suppose, in there that start to make you think, well, maybe I'm an abductee. Most ghost books don't start with the author saying, when you read this book, you should keep a pad next to you. And if you have any, increased heart rate, or you feel uncomfortable, or you have any strange memories, you should jot it down. But that's the case in Edith Fiore's book. And there's been similar things I've read in other abduction books over the years. So I'm not dismissing the abduction phenomenon insofar that there probably is a phenomenological root at a lot of it. I certainly know my little man encounter isn't common, or doesn't share much in common with other paranormal or other sleep paralysis experiences that I did have later in life that I might talk about on another video. But I also don't think that a lot of the stories that have built around it about extraterrestrials and narratives, particularly that have been drawn out under hypnosis, should be approached very easily. I think we should really question what made these people remember. What was the culture they were exposed to? What were the books or the hypnotherapists that they worked with? Anyway, thank you for listening to my story about the little man, and also my take on Edith Fiore's book and other abduction books. If you liked what I spoke about, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, where you can also watch the weekly podcast I record with Jen Durrell live every Saturday at 11 p.m. It's actually more of a live stream than a podcast. But you can watch that there as well. And in the meantime, until I talk to you next, keep it weird.